Hello, good evening, everybody. Welcome. It's an honor to have all of you here. I am Blake Eskin, and I'm just going to just let everybody get settled in. Please, it's up to you, but we like to leave our cameras on just to sort of feel a sense of connection with other people. That we are in a group here. It's nice to see some faces I've seen before, and nice to see some faces that I don't think I've seen before here. So welcome. Anyway, we're going to, you can put questions in the chat at any time. I will take them, I will pass them along, to I guess all three of our host Jessica and our two guests are academics, so they're used to the flow of the Zoom. Anyway, I just want to let you know, if you didn't, that Design Observer was founded in 2003 by Jessica Helfand, Michael Beirut. Hello, Michael. Rick Pointer and the late William Drentel as a platform for conversation about design and the larger world. And it was about bringing that conversation to an audience, including designers, but not only designers. Design Observer has been about provoking and sustaining and elevating conversation about design, whether in traditional ventures like books or websites or podcasts or events. All of these really have to do with the mission of engaging a broader community by sharing ideas on ways that design is shaped by and shapes our lives. We are here tonight, and I am just, we're at 5 after the hour, I'm just going to hand things over to Jessica, and Jessica's going to introduce our two guests tonight.
Thank you, Blake, and thank you all for coming at this first day of October in our broken world. It is a broken world, but I will say that one thing that is not broken is the Design Observer studio sessions. And I'm just so delighted that so many of you shown up, and you won't be disappointed because the guests that we have tonight are not only in their own right interesting individual people, scholars, designers, writers, historians, but together they have done a remarkable thing in writing this book, which, I'm sorry, my lighting is really bad, but I know you all know what it looks like, and you should all own this book, and you should all read this book because the essays in it are as fascinating as the subject, and of course the subject is W.E.B. Du Bois, who was many things. He was a social scientist, a historian, a philosopher, a novelist, a poet, and one of the first great American public intellectuals who was actually the first African-American to earn a Ph.D. from Harvard. But his research extended beyond the academy to the masses. And I think that this subject of how data and information and the visual language of information reaches so many people, and particularly the subject matter that he dealt with, which was the enlightenment of visualizing Black America, is something that commands our attention, especially now. So I want to introduce our speakers and we'll get right to it. We're joined tonight by Britt Rusert and Silas Munro. Britt is a writer and culture historian who received her Ph.D. in English and Feminist Studies from Duke. She's currently associate professor in the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies at UMass Amherst, where her work focuses on many things. I'm going to name some of them: Black speculative fiction, visual culture, race, science, slavery and abolition, feminist and queer approaches to science, culture, and critical theory. She is joined by designer, writer, and currently associate professor at Otis College of Art and Design in Los Angeles, Silas Munro, who received his BFA and MFA in design, respectively, from RISD and CalArts. Silas has written for numerous publications and has designed publications and identities for many museums, including the Museum of Modern Art, the Venice Biennale, and the Cooper Hewitt. He is the co-author with Britt Rusert of this marvelous book called W.E.B. Du Bois, Data Portraits, Visualizing Black America. It was published in 2018 by Princeton Architectural Press, and it is an exquisite book. So I want to start, Britt, with you. I have a great fascination with people like W.E.B. Du Bois, who, to my mind, I was reminded of Florence Nightingale, who 50 years earlier had made this incredible data information graphic, famous diagram that showed, in fact, that more soldiers died during the Crimean War as a result of gunfire in the camps. I'm sorry, as a result of poor health conditions in the camps than as a result of gunfire. And as I recall, was not well received by the British government. And I imagine that at the time that Du Bois was doing the work that he was doing as a visual sociologist and as a Black visual sociologist, this would have been a very difficult thing to communicate this work. So I wonder if you could start by just telling us how you became interested in this work, how you discovered it, and what made you decide to write this book.
My personal interest in this topic sort of came because I had been working on some of Du Bois's writing. I work at UMass Amherst, and I had been working in the Du Bois papers, looking through some of Du Bois's unpublished speculative fiction. Across Du Bois's life, he wrote science fiction, fantasy. He wrote noir narratives. He wrote in all of these popular genres. And this is sort of a side of Du Bois that we don't know much about. We think about him as the, author of The Souls of Black Folk, of many really important, serious studies of Black history, politics, philosophy. We don't think about him as a reader or a writer of pulp fiction. So I was sort of really interested in this pulp side of Du Bois as a reader and writer of genre fiction. And around this time, I was working on this project with my colleague, Adrienne Brown at the University of Chicago. We were editing this little known story by Du Bois called The Princess Steal, which we later published. And at the same moment that we were doing research on that story, I started seeing some coverage online about these images. And I think that the impetus for some of these more popular pieces came from the fact that the Library of Congress had recently digitized these images, so that these Du Bois infographics are all available online through the Library of Congress. And so this repository of the images became public. And so when I looked at these images, I was just struck by them. I think, there's something about them that pops. They just really, they just sort of, jump from the page. So I was just initially really struck with them at a visual level. I was sort of secondly interested in them because at the beginning of this story called The Princess Steal, Du Bois is basically talking about a Black sociological lab. He's talking about the data that's being collected by these Black sociologists who, kind of account for and study Black life at the turn of the century. And the story also begins with this really fantastical technology that Du Bois calls a megascope. And the megascope basically projects these sociological images and graphs onto the Manhattan skyline. And that becomes a sort of entry into this fantastical allegory about racial capitalism in the Western world. So anyway, what I realized at this moment when I started, you should read it, it's a great story. What I realized when I started seeing these images, and then I was, kind of working on this text, was Du Bois actually opens The Princess Steal with a data visualization. That literally, the megascope projects the data visualization. And then I realized, oh my goodness, there's actually a historical referent here. It's these images. So for me, that my entry into the project had to do with this sort of fantastic and fantastical connection between this kind of fictive technology in Du Bois's text and this sort of fictive data visualization and their real existence in the world. So that was my entry into the project.
It's a wonderful answer, Britt, and I think that there's something about the cross-pollination of what a polymath he was as a fiction writer, as a sociologist, as a scholar, but the fact that you were able to see this visual material as depicted in fiction as something that could galvanize this project that is so visual is, I think, just a beautiful thing for our audience, many of whom are visual people, to listen to you tell the story so beautifully. I wonder if, Silas, you can tell us about what you thought when you first saw this material as somebody who works with images, who's so fluent in image culture. What was your first experience in coming across this body of work?
I was pretty shocked. I guess like the word I would use is gagged, you know, channeling RuPaul. I was just like, what? Where are these from? Why do I not know about these? And I actually saw them before Britt and Whitney approached me. I was working on a catalog design for Mark Bradford's exhibition at the Venice Biennale. And one of the texts that was in the catalog was a selection from Black Reconstruction. And so we were working on the book and finishing it as the images were digitized, like a little bit after them. And Kathy Siegel, the curator, was like, Silas, what do you think about these images? These are from Du Bois. Would we pair them with this selection from Black Reconstruction? And I was just enthralled by them. I was fascinated by them. Ultimately, visually, they were too much of a presence, you know, compared to Mark's work and all of the other voices in there. But those images stuck with me. And some of the things that I started asking, you know, I have like pretty good credentials. You know, my two design history teachers are, you know, were Doug Scott and Lorraine Wild, you know, and their teachers, you know, are pretty significant specters in design history. And so the question that I was haunted by was like, why are these not in the canon or in the discussion of graphic design history? These modernist forms that, you know, showed up 19 years before the Bauhaus, right? Before Russian constructivism, before isotype. And then I was wondering how they were made, you know, like who made these, how, you know, I mean, I knew it was Du Bois, but like, it was a lot of work. So like, my questions were, how did this come to be and be so amazing, but then not really widely known?
So you were interested, as one would be, with the fact that they present as these remarkable examples of modernism. They're also made, what, Britt, like 30, 35 years after emancipation, right? I mean, this is the early 20th century, so not that long after the Civil War. So slavery, I mean, Du Bois's father was a slave. So the idea that he, as a sociologist, feels it incumbent upon him to make this story known through this kind of visual representation that is both modern and still he's part of a trajectory, part of a tradition that's painful and historical and very real to him. So as you're doing research, Silas, you're thinking about what his influences might have been. And how did you do that? How did that come together? How did you come to understand why visual sociology, why these diagrams, and why then?
Well, it's interesting because two of the clues came from things you already mentioned. You know, the fact that he had a Ph.D. from Harvard, and Florence Nightingale, you know, who comes before him. And, you know, as someone who, even before he gets to Paris, had traveled abroad, you know, he did a fellowship in Berlin. So he was very worldly. Also, he had done the Philadelphia Negro before this project, which also has data visualization in it. And so I guess just like a good nerdy researcher, I was just trying to track the lineage of like, who were his teachers at Harvard and, you know, what models might he been exposed to. And I think maybe William Playfair came up first before Florence Nightingale, but that William Playfair is a Scottish statistician, and he is the person who created, you know, the pie chart, bar chart, area chart, like kind of one of the first folks that we know of so far to kind of take data and give it a visual form that had a kind of rhetoric. And I know how much of a polymath Du Bois was and how self-initiated he was. So I'm sure he would be looking at these references. It's like not like it came out of thin air. And Britt knows Du Bois's body of work and life better than I do. So Britt, I'd love to hear what you think too, also about, you know, his influences and what he might have been looking at.
Can I talk about something I'm researching now that I think is like a little detail we didn't have from when we were writing the book?
Please, yeah.
When you have to, we ended up doing this project. My co-editor is Whitney Battle Baptiste, who's the director of the Du Bois Center at UMass Amherst. And the actual book came about because the press came to the Du Bois Center saying we want to do a book on these images. And I just happened to walk into Whitney's office right after she had met with the editors. And she said, have you seen these images? And I was like, yes, I was planning to write on these images. So there was this kind of serendipitous encounter that led to, you know, the actual publication. But we had such a, we wanted to get the book out for, you know, the Du Bois's 150th birthday year. And so we had the short timetable. As like, I'm a pretty, well, meticulous is one word, anal might be another word for a kind of researcher. And I really like to have all of my coordinates and everything sort of, you know, I like to really feel confident about my publications and the research that goes into my pieces. And so this was the first time that I sort of published something where you know, in the introduction, we tried to signal some areas for future research, things we didn't figure out. And there was something really nice about being able to be open-ended. You know, I hope that the volume reads as a kind of invitation, and we sort of, you know, hint at places where we hope that other designers and other researchers and scholars and artists will sort of hop on to this project. And indeed, I think for me, that's been one of the most beautiful things, is to see how people have been taking up the book and have just been running with it. I can see in the chat, people who are making their, you know, using modern data to recreate these visualizations, like artistic expositions, just lots of great things being done with this work. So anyway, there was some, as a researcher, I had some anxiety letting this thing into the world before I felt like every single, you know, sort of historical detail had been fleshed out. But it's sort of one thing I'm learning is that there's something great about having something out in the world, and then you start to hear from people, and then you start to learn more. So that's been really great. And it sort of really feels like an ongoing research project for me. So I'm working right now on an essay that will end up in the Oxford Handbook for W.E.B. Du Bois, and that's giving me a chance to sort of dig deeper into some aspects of the research that we didn't get to for the book. So this is a long lead up just to say another sort of inspiration that I think hasn't been acknowledged with respect to these images is actually the American settlement movement. So we know that Du Bois was an interlocutor with Jane Addams. He went to conferences with her. He was a correspondent with her. When he was putting together the Philadelphia Negro at the University of Pennsylvania and in the 7th Ward in Philadelphia, Du Bois actually had a collaborator. She was a white woman sociologist named Isabella Eaton. And the Philadelphia Negro is actually composed of 2 studies, Du Bois's study and also Isabella Eaton's report on Black domestic service in Philadelphia. But often people don't talk about or don't read or don't cite that second part of the study. So Du Bois had this white woman collaborator in Philadelphia. And in fact, the 2 of them actually lived in the settlement house in Philadelphia together. Isabella Eaton had come from the Hull House in Chicago. She had contributed to the research and the work that Jane Addams and their whole crew was doing. And the American settlement movement was really, you know, at the cutting edge of kind of reform research and social science research at the end of the 19th century. And they were really interested in you know, studying urban organization and also studying the effects of poverty on urban communities, especially ethnic communities. And, you know, part of the premise of the settlement movement was that you would live in a settlement house, you would live among the people you were studying. And so this is just to say, this group, the American settlement movement, was deeply invested in these kinds of infographics and in these kinds of visualizations. And there's direct connections between Du Bois and these researchers. And that raises a question for me about why we don't know about that genealogy of Du Bois's relationship to the American settlement movement. I think that one reason was that this was actually a world of women researching. These settlement houses were composed of women, and Du Bois's interlocutors in the settlement movement were all women. So this is just all to say that, like, I think that there is like a really immediate kind of precedent and milieu for these visualizations in Black sociology. And it has to do with sort of like feminist social science and feminist epistemology, and a sort of a kind of history of data visualization that was coming from women in the 19th century and at the turn of the century. So
I think clearly you've got there's a book in that, or a movie in that,
so
or a series in that.
But the last thing I'll just say about this is that we should think about Du Bois' relationship to these women who are making these visualizations. And I'm curious about our desire to kind of abstract him or separate him from that milieu.
So one of the things that's interesting as you talk about the sort of biographical coordinates within which this work was made, and I know there's some stuff in the book about how he worked with students and how they actually made these documents and how they transported them. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But one of the things I was very touched by something that in this book that, and I want to get to this in terms of another piece of the biography, which is how did this work land at the time it was made in those early years of the 20th century for someone who was African American, for someone who was trying to use this work to refute the claims of racist ideology, of social Darwinism. And to the degree that this was clearly an uphill battle for him, you write in the book, one of you wrote in the book, that he was less mobile than the charts and graphs that went to the Paris Exposition. So in other words, in order for him to go, he had to travel in steerage in really difficult conditions for someone who had this incredible background. And I wonder, Silas, as someone who makes work, who has a studio practice in conjunction with teaching, what did you think about as you were looking at these images in terms of the construction of them as a kind of visual evidence, and as a maker who's dealing with an audience where the work is traveling? You design exhibitions, you do books and publications. This was 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago. What did you think of that as you were doing this research?
Yeah, I thought that detail was chilling. You know, when
Chilling.
Chilling when Britt and Whitney had unearthed that, because in a way, his journey to Paris is like this reverse middle passage for him. Like he's in the hull of a ship, and it's easier for the graphic design to get to Paris than it is for him.
Exactly.
Which I think
it's an incredible detail.
Yeah, it's really haunting, you know, to think about that in his own account, in his autobiography and his writings. You could just tell the sort of like pressure. I also empathize with him because the timeline, you know, we had a short time for the book, but so did he with his students. So I understand why he needed the collective resources of his students of color, and I think in particular women of color who were doing the sociological research, but also helping to do the design. And so it just exposed to me the sort of fraught racial capitalism that showed that the graphic design like was more valuable than this man in a certain way, at least in terms of transit. And that just
there's so many stories. There's the social capital of his work. There's the physical capital of the drawings. There's him as a vessel, in a vessel going to Paris. But to come back to the settlement question, it actually comes back to Britt, because in a sense, all work has its own kind of mobility. One of the things that we're thinking about a lot at Design Observer lately, and it's starting to inform the way we are trying to have conversations about these things, to get us all to think a little bit more about consequence, about what we're putting into the world, about the planet, about, you know, the future, about what we can control in a moment when we feel we have no control. And I wonder, Britt, as you look at this work that these women did, I know you study gender and feminist history, whether there was on some level another chapter for the work to be distributed by virtue of the kind of workforce, both the people that were helping make the documents, the people that were doing the research in Philadelphia. Did you find that there was a kind of an army of these people who wanted to keep the movement alive?
In terms of the circulation of those images?
Yeah, in terms of the circulation, the mobility of the information.
Yeah, I mean, I think my guess, and Silas just noted this, that, you know, Black women, including, you know, women who were alumni of Atlanta University and were current students, were definitely some of the people who were like, you know, out on the streets collecting the data that ended up being central for the study, who possibly were contributing to the designs themselves. So just thinking about, you know, that kind of like, yeah, Black women's labor in terms of the production of the images themselves. Then there's the question of like, who may have seen these images, you know, viewers of color at the Paris Exposition. We see the image makers signaling white working class and European audiences, but I have to wonder if part of the cosmopolitan sort of valences of the images has to do with them sort of signaling to possible visitors of color at the Paris Exposition. And then I would say that, you know, in terms of the ongoing and continued movement of the images, when the images come back, they are prize winning, and that prize sort of increases the prestige of these collection of infographics and of the American Negro exhibit more generally. And it's much sought after at World's expositions and regional expositions back in the United States. So we talk briefly in the book about how a group of Black club women in Buffalo, New York, my hometown, worked to bring the images to the Pan American Exposition in 1901. And so we do have some historical evidence and documentation around women who are also central to the further circulation of the images in the US. Can I just say, like, a little sentimental follow-up is just that making this connection, and when I realized when I was a kid and a teenager, I was weirdly obsessed with the Pan American Expo. I never traveled beyond like my home state until I was 18 years old, and so it was like, I think for me it was really important in terms of like learning something about how my place like had at one point been had this like cosmopolitan moment. So I had this like early obsession with that expo. And in terms of just this research project, when I realized that those images actually had been exhibited like in my hometown, right on the grounds of the Albright Knox Gallery in Buffalo, New York, it was a really personal moment for me to think about those infographics having been exhibited there.
I think that that's a sentiment that many of the people who are here tonight may share with you, because there's something about becoming enamored of something visual or something historical, realizing that history is an ongoing trajectory and what you're seeing is a little slice of it. And when you get excited about that, explains why you're a cultural historian, explains why Silas is part of this project. I think for many of us who work with visual material and historical material, there's something really that catapults you to a different time and place. But I want to ask a question of both of you. One of the things that obviously we're talking about the work being mobile, we're talking about the work being influential, but this was a person who was Black, working at a time when nobody was doing this work. And he was someone, I think from what I've read, for whom protest and polemic and scholarship and poetry were all intertwined. Silas, talk to me about what you think that meant in terms of data visualization. Like, where does that come from when you're someone who speaks so many languages? I mean, we might say, I'm going to say it right now, that design is a kind of international language. And he was an improbable designer in a way to work with this material. But there must have been something that he saw that was particularly powerful about data visualization as a medium of protest, of information, of dissemination of ideas. And I wonder what you think about how he steeped himself in that kind of knowledge.
Yeah, to me, when I look at them and responding to your question, I see them as an act of visual poetry. Like he felt and he knew that he could combine the rational articulation of an argument in data form to a visual and really take the notion of abstraction to sort of transcend race. And I think he knew and was quite critical about the display of how these would be presented. He not only designed the diagrams, but he designed an interactive haptic installation of the plates.
Say more about that. Can you explain that a little bit, please?
Yeah. So, well, and the exhibit was a collaboration. So, T.J. Calloway, who is a classmate of his at Fisk University, who was a Civil War clerk and connected to the government, was actually the commissioner of the Negro exhibit. And he brought on Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, who were intellectual rivals, but the two of them amassed their connections with historically Black colleges. So you have not only the plates, but you have novels, books, patents, agricultural tools, all this sort of Black knowledge and know-how that was produced by Tuskegee Institute, the Hampton Institute. I mean, there's a whole archive of knowledge that gets put into the exhibit. And the sort of hallmark function or feature of the exhibition design is that the plates are mounted on the wall and on a tabletop surface, but they're also connected to these haptic movable screens where you can literally like turn the plates over I think part of that was limited material means. You know, they didn't have a ton of resources, so they were using the backs of the prints to put, you know, diagrams on one side and then the charts and information on the other side. But there's specific instructions on the plates to lift this frame. So, you know, he literally had like interaction design that was part of this frame, and he knew that it would be in a public place and needed to attract people's eye from a distance because of where it was placed in the Palace of Social Economy. I mean, it was literally like kind of in this trade show with like the Prudential Life Insurance display is like around the corner, and like Library Association. And if you think about the other kinds of display that were designed, it was very much in like this diorama style. Like if you think of the Natural History Museum, kind of these primitive depictions of sort of social culture and humanity. And for him, the way to humanize the Black experience was actually to abstract it in a certain way. There were photographs of sort of Black bourgeoisie folks that were part of the display, but in terms of the data, and he would compare abstraction with very quotidian data points, you know, public teachers, holding land, kitchen objects, and he was portraying Black domestic life in this way that would negotiate with this mainly white audience to sort of look at the picture in a different way.
The whole notion that it's abstraction just blows my mind. Go on.
Is it okay if I just also add that this is, you know, such a fascinating moment, because it's actually a moment right before there's the famous Du Bois and Booker T split. So it's actually incredible that in the American Negro exhibition that we have work from Du Bois and Booker T together. And so it is before that kind of like moment of their split famously in the Souls of Black Folk. And I think that's something just of such historical importance to recognize. But I also think there is a way in terms of what Silas is talking about with respect to abstraction, that even within the context of this combined exhibit, where you have, you know, objects that are being made by Black industrial schools, you have the Booker T ideology of self-help and, you know, that kind of bootstraps ideology of industrial education, agricultural implements. The Du Boisian infographics look very different from that genealogy. So it's both that this is a moment in the exhibit where you can see Booker and T before they're split, but you can already start to see the kind of split. And the images, you know, are so forward looking, and they do seek, and it's something I think we say in the introduction, even within the context of the collaboration in the American Negro exhibit with Calloway and Booker T, I think they do seek to like establish their own autonomy and to sort of be read on their own terms. And I think that is part of what's so visually striking to us, and why these images do seem to like transcend time and space in a particular way, is I think that Du Bois was like using these bright colors and engaged in this kind of like proto-modernist aesthetic, because he really wanted to establish that he was sort of not on the side of advocating for Black industrial education, that his interest was in, you know, in philosophy, in the kind of like a different genealogy of Black knowledge and thought that was not just instrumental. And so I that's just to say that I think there's something that is both, that these images are marked by like forms of collaboration, but that they also really, even in their own historical moment, seek a kind of like autonomy that I think still speaks to us today.
So the range in terms of pure production, the range of years these diagrams and charts are made is what? What is the range?
How long it took them to make it?
Yeah.
Like,
what are we
basically the actual construction of the documents, like kind of like 6 weeks, because he started it at the end of the year, and it took 6 weeks for the plates to travel by ship. So it's basically, I think they get the commission like October, November, and they're basically producing it at the end of the year. So
all
and
of these
exhibitions in April. Yeah,
they're all done within that. All the things that are in this book are done within that span of time. And what is the year range? What is the year?
1899 is when they're producing it, and then it goes to the exhibit in April of 1900.
So this is just for perspective's sake, 1913 is the Armory Show, right? So abstraction in America as a commercially understood concept that's written about in the newspaper, this is a good 12 or 13 years before that happens, right? And yet, yeah, do you think you could make the argument, either one of you, that because he had this polymath education, he had the capacity to have this fluid, agile mind that realized that poetic interpretation, different kinds of diagrams, understanding abstraction, the autonomy of form, all these things you're talking about, did that come from the fact that he just had this wide open view of the world and a curiosity that did not stop?
And I think it presumes that he actually drew the images. So I like to think about it that this is something that, like, in terms of like a distributed intellectual network, where inspiration was definitely coming from Du Bois, but I think for me, it actually makes me want to know more about like aesthetic forms that were being experimented with by Black Atlantans at the turn of the century. For me, you know, as a literary scholar, I think about one of the genealogies I see here is about like the Harlem Renaissance or the New Negro Renaissance that comes before the Harlem Renaissance, that this is a moment where Du Bois is in 1900 talking about the place of Georgia and Atlanta in terms of Black modernity. Does that make sense? And so for me, this is also about like aesthetic forms and experimentation that's happening like in Atlanta, in Black Atlanta at the turn of the century, that really looks forward to the kind of experiments of the Harlem Renaissance. So I think that like Du Bois's own, like, kind of like, polymath comportment and his ability to bring all these different things together, I absolutely see that as being part of the project. You know, I'm really interested in that the first plate, the title plate, we get at the bottom of that plate, it says the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. I mean, this is amazing because this is an appearance of that famous line from The Souls of Black Folk before that book was actually published. That's another thing to say, is the famous line from The Souls of Black Folk, it actually shows up first in the Du Bois infographics at the Paris Exposition. So for me, it's like, I think that the images do represent Du Bois's interest in multiple form, genre, you know, communicating the question of race and the kind of so-called Negro problem at the turn of the 20th century coming from him. But it's also, this is like, these are aesthetic forms and a whole set of images that were issuing forth from Black students at a historically Black college in Atlanta at the turn of the century. And for me, that's actually the most stunning part about them. And I think we actually need to know more about those students, their training, their work, and to know more about their milieu.
Silas, you're agreeing?
I would agree with that. And, you know, Britt was talking about the first plate, and I want to call out a couple things to what you said. Yes, that's the first time he sort of puts the color line framework, famous line out there, which is interesting because he's also influenced by Frederick Douglass, you know, who is the first person to sort of talk about the color line before him in one of his speeches. And there's actually a bust of Frederick Douglass in the exhibition. So you can kind of see he's like got his own lineages there. And then also one of the things that's said on the first plate is that he's presenting it as evidence and rhetoric, where it says maps, charts, and other devices, which I love that term of other devices. And you can tell that he has this sort of like speculative imagination. I think Britt's right. We need to do more analysis of the sort of context of what was happening in Atlanta. You know, in my essay, I do talk about, there was this clipping, you know, from the newspapers that came out of Atlanta University that talk about William Andrew Rogers, who was an alum of the program and living in Virginia at the time that this was being worked on. So there's also this kind of maybe physically distributed team. And then in the cover of the second plate, like, he's very upfront about saying, this is the work, not just of me, but the students of Atlanta University. So he's really in typography proclaiming in type and image form this proclamation of collective effort and translation of his ideas. And I think, you know, Michael's here, other designers here, yes, you have like an art director or leader, but there's so much that happens in the creative process when you have a team, right? And I imagine that there was a lot of improvisation, a lot of response, call and response happening with the design. And you see that in the two different plates, like the typography and the visual language in the first set of plates is quite different than the second, where they start to introduce letterpress, you know, into the production to speed up the time, but they're still using this architectural lettering template, which I think is also speaking to like the DIY nature of like, what do we have to make this thing? And I think another sort of importance of the material reality of the plates is that they were one-offs. There weren't multiples. So I think that's also part of why there is this limited memory or exposure of them. And then a lot of the citations of like the exhibit when it comes back to the United States is documented in Black publications. You know, the Colored American, which Calloway was the editor of, or it's kind of put on by Black bourgeoisie. And so I think more research needs to be done in terms of exposure to the plates, both in the States and in Europe. I mean, there were about 30 million people who viewed the World's Fair in total. I'm not sure if all of them made it to this booth, but Kandinsky was 19, at the time. Did he stumble upon these and see these, or were there other artists that were influenced by this? Like, I think that's actually something I've been getting a lot of questions about, is how was it documented in Europe? It won a gold prize, but I don't know, Britt, if you want to respond to that, or like, I know we've conjectured a lot about its reception. In your essay, you write about the co-creation of sociological knowledge with the audience.
Yeah, and I also would just add to this, when I've taught this material, my students have been really interested in thinking and really grappling with these images as student work. And increasingly, I mean, I think, Silas, you and I talked about this early on, that when you start really looking at like the pencil markings, you start to see more and more hands at work. And that's something I just think is so fascinating, that there is like a level of consistency across the two series. But when you start looking at them more and more, you realize that you start to see more and more hands, more and more creators in the images. And I have to say, there is a reason why we decided to order the images that we did, in terms of, I think, visual strikingness and maybe also just like finish and polish. They get a little rougher. I don't know what you think about the styles. They get a little rougher by the end.
Yeah.
And when I've taught these images, I've had a couple of students sort of point out, you can tell there's a couple images where it seems like the coloring is done in sort of an uninspired way. So I've also just been trying to think about this again in terms of like the politics of student work, what these students' relationship to this project may have been. They all clearly didn't have the same comportment and commitment to these Du Boisian images. And I think there's something kind of beautiful and amazing at sort of looking at the images, looking closely at the images that aren't like colored as perfectly, or seem to have like a different kind of finish than the more professional looking images.
I think we're going to go to a question, Blake. You want to?
Yeah, sure. So we have a question actually from Michael Beirut, which is very much in this direction. I think there's really kind of two parts to it. One is kind of trying to understand what models they were looking at. Besides, I guess you mentioned William Playfair, and you've talked a little bit about the the context of Atlanta. Then the second half of the question, which is actually Michael's first half of the question, is how unprecedented were these data visualizations for 1900? Were there any people anywhere on any subject creating work this sophisticated? And so I'm not sure, either of you, I'm not sure which of you want to take this one.
I can say one thing to everyone in the room. I think we need like a systematic study of data visualizations at world expositions in 1900. That's something that like is on. If COVID didn't happen, if I had childcare, or if I had a school to send my child to, that's what I would be doing right now. Is I want to like do more research in the Library of Congress. I want to try to do like a systematic study of what data visualization look like at in the social economy building, at the Paris Exposition, and then at the Central World Expos in the United States, probably coming starting with like the exhibition in Chicago in 1893 and going through the exhibitions that go through around like 1905 and 1906. I think that will give us like a better sense of like how these images may relate to other data visualization happening right at this moment, and would also give us a better indication of what is so distinctive and unique about these images.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Britt. I would love to, maybe we can work on that study together because that sounds super fascinating. One of the things that I was thinking about that happens a little bit after, that was also recently digitized, is this color manual color problems, a practical manual for the lay student. What's her name? Emily Noyes Vanderpool. So this, before Joseph Albers and Itten's, books on color study, this came out in 1903. And if you look at some of the ways that she's charting and mapping color, there are a lot of similarities to some of the grids and geometric shape and form that Du Bois is using. So I wish I had a better answer for this, but I know that there are other kind of folks who are starting to take on this idea of like abstraction as a way to communicate something, or to really like distill a form down.
Do you think there's an argument to be made, Silas, that one of the values of abstraction was to make it more universal? As much as he was a Black man leading a team, making work to elucidate the kinds of problems he was seeing in the world that needed to be shown through this evidence, I'm just curious about the struggle between finding a formal language that resonated with everybody and finding something that had a kind of quality of a vernacular that was specific to a world he inhabited, to publications he saw, to what he saw in Atlanta. What do you think that there was a tension there between the universal and the unique?
I think there always is, and that kind of, I think, Joseph Campbell quote or whatever, that we actually find the universal in the personal in certain ways, or there's a kind of a flipping back and forth between those two things. I do know that, if you look at Du Bois's later body of work of influencing design too, like The Crisis, he was the editor and producer for that. And commissioned a ton of amazing illustrators, designers who were helping to create a new visual language of Black culture, which, he ends up going on to connect to the sort of discourse in different ways of the Harlem Renaissance. But I know that he was shrewd, and he knew that he was trying to find a way to express his ideas of universality and equality. And I think that the charts were just like an experiment. I feel like you could look at his body of work as like a designer doing prototypes of like, let me try this data visualization. Let me try it again in color, as plates versus in a report, about a different city. So I think he was really iterating in real time and like open to trying something new.
Yeah, there's another question from Phil, and Phil, I don't want to mispronounce your last name, so I will just say it's from Phil. It's a question: to what extent did Du Bois's aesthetic theory or visual imagination change over time? And you were starting to get at a little bit of this in your last answer, Silas, how he incorporated visual sociology or visual history into his writings or intellectual production. On to 1963 when he died.
Britt, do you want to
Well,
weigh in on that?
I think you're exactly right about The Crisis. We see a similar interest in modernist aesthetics there, but squarely within the modernist period. So I think The Crisis is a great place to look. I know, Phil, is there a culture in these sessions of allowing the person who asked the question to answer it? Because I think Phil might have an answer to this question.
Sure, why not?
I would like to know.
Go ahead, Phil. Do you have a theory?
Because Phil, I know, is great on the late Du Bois. I'm better on the early Du Bois.
Good evening. Thanks for the invitation. I think the Crisis covers in particular, as Silas was mentioning, commissioning the artists, particularly the Harlem Renaissance era artists. But as I'm thinking about the question here in real time, he also edited a scholarly journal called Phylon out of the university during his second stint teaching there. And he incorporated poetry and some visual art within that journal as well. And so I'll just mention that very briefly, but I'm also curious about the kind of visual history of his later career. which is a part of my ongoing research.
Mm-hmm. You know, I guess I would also say, and again, I'm sorry, bringing us back to early Du Bois, I'm really interested in like how, you know, the aesthetics of the images are clean cut, colorful, like bright. And it's in terms of, you know, we sort of see it in terms of what we've been talking about as a sort of visual, this kind of very efficient visual economy. And this is just so different from Du Bois's aesthetics as a writer. That like, you know, in The Souls of Black Folk, it's about opacity. His writing is like sort of purposely convoluted. He's talking about like life within the veil, and that is sort of figured through like a very kind of like Gothic and Baroque language. And so for me, I guess it's really striking to think about the difference between the aesthetics of Du Bois's writing and what we see in terms of these images. And it would be really interesting to try to like track that across his career.
The short story you mentioned at the beginning, where he's projecting things on the sky, what year was that?
So we believe that it was published between 1908 and we believe that it was written between 1908 and 1910. It was never published. Du Bois did not have a lot of luck publishing and placing these eccentric genre fiction stories, but he continued to write them across his career. And we know that it was basically he wrote this at the end of his first stint at Atlanta University. And we know that it was published within that time frame because he references a skyscraper in New York that goes up in 1908.
And so as a historian, you're looking to place these things based on anything you can find anecdotally. Do you have a sense that the fiction was influencing the information design, was influencing the teaching? Is that something you just figure out in terms of the chronology that you're able to unearth?
Like the relationship between the images?
Yeah, like what influenced what? I mean, when you look at somebody like this who does have these polymathic tendencies, I'm just curious. I mean, we're you know, Michael's asking this question about tracing his influences and other influences. I know you mentioned the Theaster Gates paintings. Yeah. You're now going back in time trying to reverse engineer what you think, what you're telling us in this wonderful book, what might have happened. But in terms of his own practice,
yeah,
how does one thing influence the other? Are you able to determine that?
I mean, I don't know if I can trace like causality, but it seems like he's experimenting with like different affective registers in these different forms. So he's interested in the writing at this moment in this kind of, I would say it's like an aesthetic of the Gothic, and it's really influenced by like Hegelianism and all of his teachers and professors at Harvard who are really interested in German Romanticism. Then I see in the images, it's this, you know, this real desire to use sort of clean-cut lines and forms to express, I think, a more universal message as we've been talking about. So I think the priority is on like clear messaging and trying to reach as broad of an audience as possible. Then when it comes to the, you know, the popular fiction and the genre fiction, I think that's where Du Bois is like in his study. He was a prolific writer and he wrote like every day. For me, I imagine him doing that kind of writing like in his study and more for himself than for others. So it's also deeply experimental in terms of he's using like the tropes of genre fiction to try to like, I think sort of like replaying and reworking things that are happening, you know, on the job in terms of, there is like a just kind of like more, I feel like the popular fiction allows him like a kind of space for him to play and experiment that these other forms don't allow for him.
Can I ask?
You? Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah. I just had a question about like, how do these disappear? How quickly do they disappear? And I mean, you mentioned that they are published in Black publications. Do they disappear from the sort of mass world of exhibitions, but are remembered in a Black context, or do they disappear and then just resurface?
So I think this is a
later?
Great question. This is a key question for me. We know that Du Bois continued to have interest in the images, and we think wanted to use the images for educational purposes, maybe for exhibition purposes in Atlanta after they toured around the United States. And we talk in the introduction about a letter we found where Du Bois writes to the librarian of the Library of Congress and asks for the images to be returned. And we know that they weren't returned because they exist as a complete set in the archives of the Library of Congress. This is like a haunting letter for me because it suggests that Du Bois wanted to further circulate and wanted future audiences, probably Black audiences, for these images, and that didn't happen because the funding that he received came from the state, and all of these materials from the American Negro exhibit were basically the property of the U.S. government once the exhibition ended. So there is sort of this like, we are lucky to have them now, but it's also interesting to think about like that missed history or that lost history and the future transmission of those images that didn't happen in Du Bois's own moment because they were deposited in the collections of the Library of Congress. And of course, that stopped the circulation of the images and severely limited who would have had access to them. And it also raises interesting questions of how they were cataloged at the Library of Congress. My guess is like they were probably cataloged as like scientific illustrations and not as art objects. And I think that's something we've been sort of grappling with and thinking about as well.
It's interesting to know. I remember when that letter was discovered by you, and isn't it around the same time? Isn't it like 1909? Isn't it around the same time he's writing the Princess Steel piece potentially? So I'm wondering if he's like writing about it and like thinking about the charts and maybe even dreaming about it because of how sort of speculative that story is, and maybe he's inspired to get it back, get the plates back and plan some kind of exhibition, dialogue, or even extension of the body of work.
That's great. Yeah, and we know also at this moment he was trying to get funding to get a reflectograph, so basically like an overhead projector. So that image, that like, this fantastical image of this data visualization being projected in the story has like a very mundane connection to the fact that he really wanted an overhead projector for his classes.
Really?
Yes.
Oh,
that's
such
so
a charming
cool.
detail. I love that. That's so great.
One other thing that I was thinking about with Blake's question, Britt, is Alden Morris's essay in the book and his research of, he wrote the foremost biography of Du Bois called The Scholar Denied, and he talks a lot about the ways in which white sociology and sociologists kind of erase or minimize Du Bois's impact, because even if you just look at what he produced at Atlanta University, there's volumes of sociological research that he and his students create and publish, but maybe don't really get a wider distribution because of racism and bias, both within sociology, but also the world at large. Was
there an image that surprised you the most? Is there one that stands out for you, Silas? Either one of you, actually. I'm curious. And the one for me, like the one on illiteracy, which is woven, and you write in the caption that it's an unusual marker of a kind of, why is it woven? Is there something about the language of the interwoven data streams that is supposed to be saying something to us? I wonder if there's something that jumped out to either one of you.
I think the diagrams that I'm most drawn to and that surprise me are the ones where he creates his own graphic typology. Like he's creating his own form. I think the lattice illiteracy is like that. There's another diagram on Negro property in two cities of Georgia where he sort of weaves bar charts together. And then of course that spiral, which is on the cover, which is, just so striking, where it's combining, both a bar chart and kind of a pie chart. And there's actually a number of those bar charts that I think they literally just run out of space to depict the scale. Like there's one, plate 26, Occupations of Georgia Negroes, where it's like agricultural laborers. The bar goes to the edge of the composition and then doubles back to catch the amount of data. And so that's where you get more of this idea that they're creating things in real time under a deadline, which for me, I'm very deadline driven. Innovation happens, when you're forced to sort of generate something under pressure. And I think that combination of pressure and ingenuity and sort of a scrappiness allowed them to create these really inventive and really surprising outcomes.
I love plate 31 because it's the only image that uses pink and purple. And it also has a photograph of a young Black boy and a Black woman. And I like to imagine that a woman drew this image. It has a different color palette than the rest of the images. It has this gold seal.
Would you mind holding it up? I'm not sure it's going to
Yeah, I
look
wasn't
perfect,
sure
but
that was like weird to do. Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay. And like Silas, I continue to be really struck by the spirals. There's also the red spiral on it's plate 11, the city and rural population. It's like
yeah, that one's haunting.
It's so interesting because the spiral actually represents not flight to the city, but it says Negroes living in the country and villages. And to me, this is like the spiral represents like flight to the cities, urbanization, the Great Migration, like the rush of the city, not the country, but it actually represents the country. And there's just something to me about these red spirals that like captures something about, you know, the intensification of mob violence and sort of racist activity in this particular moment, the deep red. And I don't know, there's just something gratuitous about those spirals that I think is really, really, really striking and important.
Do you have an Go ahead.
One more I would mention too, I think, Britt, this is one of your favorite ones too, is this slaves and free Negroes and this like red and black, which is definitely like an homage to the Pan-African Congress colors. But it's funny because you were talking about, I agree with you, the plates at the beginning tend to be more precise and like rational, but then there's this like total tattered edge, you know, to the black, this deckled sort of formation, which happens in another pie chart that also has kind of vectors coming through. And so it looks like at first like the error of someone with unskilled hand-eye coordination, but then you can tell this is what I mean by visual poetry. Like he and the team are making a statement about this idea of sort of freedom and people as property, and have this very hard-edged line that's representing, you know, one population and this tattered edge and sort of a reference to skin and blood.
Did you discover in your research, Britt, what kind of material they were drawing from? Was it voluminous amounts of census records? Was it text? Was it like, what were they actually translating into what we're talking about tonight?
So it's original data that Du Bois and his sociological team were compiling. So, you know, it's their own data. That's something that shouldn't get lost in this discussion, is that they're Black visualizations based on Black data about Black life collected by Black researchers. One of the interesting things that we sort of learned was, at first we thought that, you know, they're drawing on many sources. So it includes their own data, some other like governmental records, census data. But an interesting thing is, I think early on, because the timetable was so short, because it was, you know, they had to do this so quickly, I think that, at least I presume, that the data had already been collected and that they were just drawing on other sources to make these visualizations. But an interesting thing that we realized was that this sociological lab at Atlanta University, headed by Du Bois, was actually being funded by the Department of Labor to conduct these studies. And so some of the studies that they're referencing are state studies, but they were compiled by Du Bois's team. Does that make sense? So the things that they're citing appear to be that they're like governmental records, and they're governmental studies, but the studies were conducted by Du Bois and his students. So this is really original work. And there's so much more work that needs to be done to learn about, you know, these studies that were all compiled together in the volumes that Silas referenced. They're the Atlanta University publications. And it's just, you know, these were really groundbreaking sociological studies that they were conducting.
I guess I wanted to come back with one more question about the rediscovery. And in part because I've seen them, I think I first saw one maybe in Harper's Magazine or something, like in one of their, you know, in the front of the book where they'll show, but like it's something that's kind of come up, you know, every 6 months, every 9 months in social media over the last decade. And it's like, hey, Du Bois was a, you know, graphic designer. Du Bois was a data visualizer. And I just am curious about like what, you know, how you have observed that. And of course, the rediscovery has to do with the fact that it's digitized in the Library of Congress. So the thing that made it disappear ends up being the thing that made it accessible in a weird way. But I just wanted to ask you kind of like, I don't think they're memes, but they circulate the way viral content does, the way images that are trying to make some of the same points or related points now are. And I just wonder like what you think of the reemergence in the sort of, in that kind of environment.
I think there's a lot of synchronicity, you know, with when these things came to the surface. You know, they were digitized in the age of big data. And I think they're probably digitized as part of efforts by the Library of Congress and other institutions to take their archival material into a digital space, you know, and I'm sure there was some thought about the impact and how these plates might reach people. In fact, you know, the library itself and the librarians, you know, crafted like articles, you know, like blog post on the sort of nature of the plates, the exhibition, and created a narrative out of it. And I think, you know, unfortunately and painfully for me personally is also the intense problems with race in America that are just resurfacing yet again. It feels like sort of a painful loss, you know, that we lost these for so long. And I think that the urgency of them visually and the urgency of the content and form together is so resonant with our time, where there is this preponderance of data. And I think when you visualize data, it gives you this sense that there's a human touch point or entry point to understand something as complex as, you know, the slave trade. And I think that diagram on the first plate, where based on his PhD at Harvard, where he interprets it into graphic form that Mabel Wilson writes so eloquently about, you know, he's able to express a very complex system of human trafficking and profit and capitalism into one image that you can read instantaneously. So he's very much ahead of his time. And then also in this weird speculative Afrofuturism that's also part of the, you know, Britt's research is really did picture a time where data is projected, you know, into our environment. You know, this idea of augmented reality is not too different from the, what is it called again? The megascope?
Yeah.
Britt? Yeah. So, I mean, like that idea, or the screens of data, and this idea of designing things for experience or interaction, or spectacle, are just, they hit all of that, plus the social change aspect. It's like these were designed in 2017, not in 1900.
I thought it was so powerful in his essay that Alden Morris said that he never adjusted to the racial insults that he encountered wherever he went, but instead he got angry in 5 languages. He knew how to get angry in 5 languages. And so I wonder, just this whole idea of protest, visual language, data that is, do you think he had a sense, here's my question, do you think he had a sense that there was something timeless about making this work? That I mean, obviously it was at a moment in time, all of this research comes together, he's working with a team of people, these things go, they travel, he travels with them, they go to France, they come back. He lived a very long life. I think he died at 95, right? So, but this is really, this body of work was done quite early in his professional life. Was he, in those ensuing years, did it follow him? Did it become more well known while he was alive, or did it not? Did it completely recede from public view?
He devotes one line to it in in his autobiography that's written later in his one of many autobiographies. He basically he talks about putting together this group of images that were then sent ahead to the Paris exposition, and that's all he gives us. I think it's, I mean, it would be more satisfying for us as researchers if he gave us a whole history, but there's something to me about, I don't know if it necessarily matters that in the scope of his career and when he reflects back on his life that the infographics don't like hold a more prominent place in his memory. I think there's something about like their ephemerality and the fact that they sort of like existed undercover for so many decades and now they're like newly available to us. I mean,
I think you just put your finger on it. Are these infographics, he saw them as ephemeral, but we're not seeing them that way, right? I mean, there's something by, maybe I'm just, I just think by its very nature, there's something about information design that's meant to capture and cement something. And yet that's the thing about ephemera, is that it's actually an oxymoron. It's meant to go away, but it's not.
I think that's true, but I think he would be depressed that they're timeless because the metrics still pertain. And I think that's what people are saying in terms of like redoing this data, is that it's the changing same in terms of the status of Blackness and Black people in America, is that that it's timeless because racism and white supremacy still prevails. So I mean, I think there is something about them, that the abstraction that feels like that there's something like that feels like they're timeless in terms of their aesthetic. But I think that I think that Du Bois would be delighted. He would be delighted to know that they're being recirculated. I know he would. He would be delighted. But I think he would also be probably depressed to know that these images also speak to us because the things that they convey are still with us and have not been solved.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, Britt. I totally agree with that. And I would also add, I'm holding this up. This is an LP of a verbal autobiography that Moses Ashe, at the end of his life, interviewed Du Bois. And there's various chapters on his life. There's one chapter where he's talking about the time in Atlanta. And he recounts this experience where he hears about a man that was lynched in Atlanta, and describes in detail having to walk by his body being displayed, and sort of the abstraction of his fingers and toes, like this grotesque display. And he talks about this intense frustration of it wasn't enough just to talk about this idea of equality or all of his ideas, but I needed to act. And I feel like there was something about that. I don't know if he's referencing the plates directly, but I think because it was at that time, this idea of like starting to create this framework of action, that whatever he was doing, whether it was writing novels or poetry or history or philosophy or making these plates, like he was very interested in making arguments that had a public impact, that had a kind of visibility and kind of a persuasiveness. And I think it is paradoxical, as Britt is mentioning, that this is so still appropriate, sadly. And so I think there's a bit of tension between like his excitement about these being known, but then maybe a kind of frustration or a feeling of paralyzation that they don't actually change the world that he's describing in the diagrams.
We've got about 10 minutes. We've got 2 questions in the chat. One is from Zaya Sampson. Question is, what inspired you, Britt, as a white woman, to take on this research? And how did you feel it affected your experience with gathering the information?
Thanks for that question. So, this was for me, so I'm a scholar of African-American studies, and I also work in gender studies. So this is part of a broader commitment to Black studies and my research in the field. But I do have to say, and I teach in the Du Bois department at UMass Amherst, in a place where Du Bois didn't teach, but Du Bois's widow, Shirley Graham Du Bois, taught. So I am very fascinated by Du Bois, but I have also at times I wonder about my interest in a figure who had a problematic relationship to many women in his life and and to just to women intellectuals more generally. And so in terms of this, and there is a way in which Du Bois with like the kind of capital D at times is an umbrella term that covers over lots of agents and networks. And so from my position teaching in the Du Bois department, the person we hear about and the stories we hear about all the time are sometimes about Du Bois, but are mostly about Shirley Graham Du Bois. So I don't know, I thought about her a lot as I was working on this project. And I do also have to say that I have found myself being attracted to this side of the story about Du Bois's relationship to white women sociologists. Like that, I want to know more about that. And that may have something to do with my own subject position, I might say. Does that help? Does that answer your question a bit? Thank you for it.
Yes, thank you.
Wasn't there also, I mean, I know less about this, but sort of reports about Du Bois's perspective on women was like not the best in terms of his view on women. I'm not sure if I'm just kind of rumor mongering, Britt.
Well, Farah Jasmine Griffin has a great, a kind of classic essay on Du Bois was great on feminist ideology and sort of ideals, but his relationship to feminist intellectuals was much more complicated, and he does have a kind of pattern of responding to white women who are interlocutors and sort of ignoring or neglecting Black women who wrote to him, who wanted to be published in his journals. And so there is, I guess in terms of our story, I think that's why I'm very persistent and keep raising the question of like Black women researchers, because I think there's probably a reason why we know that he was connected to Jane Addams and Isabella Eaton and these white women, and the Black women who were definitely engaged with this research remain unnamed. So I hope if there are students in the room or there are people interested in continuing with this work, I think there's a lot to be done there. In those Atlanta University records, there are names, and we just need to follow up on those names and find out who those women were. They're also photographed in the Du Bois photographs as well.
We have a question from Diane. Would you recommend an autobiography? You said there was more than one as an entry point for a layperson who has no background to get started, I'm assuming, learning about Du Bois. So would you, Silas, would you start with the Moses Ashe record? Would you start with a book? Where would you start?
I like listening. I like listening to his voice. So I don't know. I feel like there's a kind of a connection that is there. Of course, Alden's work for sure. And then I know Britt knows him better in all the texts, so I would totally defer to her opinion on what to read. But there's so much. That's actually what I'm finding that is like amazing and challenging, is like he had all these facets, and I'm discovering more about him. And I'm actually reading a biography of Elaine Locke, and there's a lot of mentions of their interactions and their different perspectives on Black life and Black culture and Black aesthetics. And that's sort of where I was starting to get that information about his relationship to women and particularly to white women.
Mm-hmm. I would also just follow up. Those are great recommendations. David Levering Lewis's 2-volume biography of Du Bois is the classic study of Du Bois. So I would definitely suggest that. It's based on years and years of research. And Du Bois's own autobiographies are fascinating to read, and I think they can be read with Lewis's biography. I think reading them together could be really fascinating. I would also recommend Saidiya Hartman's book.
Yes.
Because, this is going to be a more artful, experimental account of Du Bois, but she has a chapter where she kind of imagines and speculates on the conditions of Du Bois's research and what it was like, for him in his time in the 7th Ward in Philadelphia, and Du Bois like kind of arriving in Philadelphia in this working class neighborhood as like what she talks about as like a kind of cosmopolitan, as a dandy, and sort of like does this really amazing kind of speculative work around like his research and thinking about Du Bois like on the ground and what that must have been like, and how his research subjects and the people he was interviewing must have like what they may have thought about encountering him. And so I just think that she just does like a lot of really kind of amazing work around him if you want to sort of get like a different perspective on this phase of Du Bois's career.
Great. And we have one last question, which is just, do we know just how much of the work is done by students and others? How much is Du Bois and how much is other people?
I mean, it's hard to tell exactly, but I would argue based on the timeline and all of the hands I'm looking closely at the plates a lot. I think William Andrew Rogers, was I think kind of a point person in terms of like actually executing the graphics, but the amount of precision, the amount of data, the amount of information, it would have been implausible for just the two of them, or just a couple of students to work on it. That it probably was, when you have a big project come into the studio, as someone who runs the studio, it's like everyone's working on it, nonstop. And so I think it's, without further investigation, and maybe even with, it's sort of sometimes hard to tell whose hand is there, right? In the work.
All right. Well, Anthony, thank you for that question. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. Thank you for a very lively chat. And thanks also for a couple people provided some sources, some links to follow, as well as our guest provided some links to follow. And that's usually something I do when I'm not, but I'm not watching the door too and letting people in. So yes, there's a message here. If we didn't answer your question, feel free to email us. And Britt has put her email in the chat. And thank you, everybody. I just want to this has been a Design Observer Studio session. I hope we can do an interactive haptic one next time. We'll have to get on that. I just love that idea. And perhaps, that may take being in person, but I just, I want to thank Silas and Britt for their time, for sharing their wisdom and their knowledge and their research. Big thanks to Jessica Helfand for convening us all here today. Big thanks to the Design Observer team, including Betsy Vardell and our intern Adina Karp, who is here. And the net proceeds for this go to Design for America. We charge a nominal fee just to so people make a commitment and join us, and then that's where the funding goes from. Please do check out the Design Observer Cooperative. It is our membership program, and you can find it at substack.com/designobserver. Also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and just thank you, all of you, for taking the time to join us. I want to mention that, as you may have seen, this is being recorded. We're not planning to post it. We may excerpt it at some point on the Observatory, our podcast, but really we're just trying to create a special experience for the people who are here. So thank you all for being here. So I have the power to unmute people, and this is one of those things I should know as a professor how to do. But perhaps if somebody wants to tell me where I find this in the chat, I think it's unmute all. There it is. Got it. So just thank you, everybody. Thanks for being
Britt
here.
And Silas.
And thanks. This was a really great event. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and I guess if you're on the West Coast, and I think somebody came in from even Asia, enjoy the rest of your morning, and we'll see you. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Silas and